The desert range stretched for miles, a barren sea of dust and heat, shimmering like waves under the afternoon sun. Targets sat in the distance, rusted steel plates, propped against worn posts, scarred with thousands of bullet marks from years of training. A faint breeze carried the dry tang of sand and gunpowder, familiar to anyone who had lung enough in the rhythm of war. The Navy SEAL chief stood at the edge of the line, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the shooters ahead of him. He had seen it all before: rookies fumbling with their rifles, veterans carrying themselves with quiet efficiency, and the occasional natural talent who could make steel sing with precision. Nothing surprised him anymore. Or so he thought. Then he saw her. She lay prone in the sand, body aligned perfectly behind a Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle, the kind of weapon that demanded strength, discipline, and experience just to fire, let alone master. The rifle itself looked oversized, a beast of steel and recoil, weighing nearly 30 pounds. Most soldiers treated it with reverence or fear. Yet she rested against it, as though it were an extension of her own body, her cheek pressed to the stock, her eyes locked through the scope. The chief frowned slightly. Women in sniper roles were rarer, still in units that demanded not just technical skill, but relentless endurance. He had seen operators crumble under the Barrett's weight, their shoulders bruised, their accuracy shattered by the thunderous recoil. But she looked unnervingly calm, like the rifle was nothing more than a bow she had been stringing all her life. He tilted his head, studying her movements. No wasted energy. Every adjustment she made was small, precise, her hand nudging the bipod a fraction of an inch into the sand, her body settling naturally behind the rifle's line of recoil. She didn't fidget, didn't overcompensate. The chief recognized it instantly. Muscle memory. This wasn't someone learning the weapon. This was someone who had lived with it. Who the hell is she? He muttered under his breath. No one answered. The other shooters were too focused on their own drills, unaware of what was about to happen. A hush seemed to fall across the range as she exhaled slowly. He could almost see the rhythm of her breathing, chest rising and falling with perfect control. She waited. Not impatiently, not nervously, just waited, as if she could feel the air itself settle around her. Then, without warning, the crack of the Barrett split the silence. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, a brutal, chest-shaking roar that made several nearby shooters flinch. The rifle's recoil slammed back, but she absorbed it effortlessly, her shoulder giving just enough to tame the beast. Through the chief's trained eyes, it was flawless execution, smooth, practiced, without hesitation. He followed her gaze toward the distant horizon, squinting against the sun. The target was so far away, it looked like nothing more than a dot, barely visible against the endless desert. A moment later, a metallic clang echoed faintly back across the range. Bullseye. The chief's brow furrowed. One shot, one hit. At a distance that most soldiers couldn't even dream of. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply shifted slightly, chambered another round with fluid motion, and returned her eye to the scope. Crack. Again, the target sang with impact. Crack. Another hit. The chief found himself stepping closer, unable to resist. He had spent decades training with the world's best marksmen. He knew the difference between luck and mastery. Luck was sloppy, lucky shots didn't repeat. But mastery was quiet, efficient, and unshakable. And what he was witnessing now, this was mastery. He felt the prickle of curiosity crawling up his spine. Whoever she wasn't just another shooter passing through the range. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came only from real combat experience carved into bone, not just drilled on a training line. The Barrett roared again, and again the steel sang back. The chief's mind drifted through 1,000 possibilities. Maybe she was an instructor brought in from another unit. Maybe she had years of service hidden under a plain uniform. Or maybe she was exactly what the rumors whispered, a ghost with a rifle, someone whose shots had shaped battles from distances most men couldn't even see. What unsettled him most wasn't just her precision. It was the silence around her. Most shooters, even professionals, left traces of nerves, tight jaws, twitching fingers, restless movements. She left nothing. Her breathing, her hands, her posture, it was all absolute control. She was as still as the rifle itself, a predator hidden in plain sight. The chief exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth tightening. He had learned long ago that skill could be taught, but presence was something different. Presence meant the battlefield bent around you. Presence meant enemies never saw you until it was too late. Presence meant you carried a record, whether confirmed by command or whispered in shadows that followed you everywhere you went. And as he stood there, arms crossed, sweat dripping down his neck under the relentless desert sun, the chief realized something that tightened his chest. She wasn't here to prove herself. She wasn't here to learn. She was here because she had already proven herself, somewhere, out there, far beyond the safe lines of a training range. The chief didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her story. But as the Barrett thundered again and again, each shot precise, each hit undeniable, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't just another sniper. This was someone whose story was already legend. And for the first time in years, the chief felt that rare spark in his gut, the spark that told him he had just crossed paths with history. The Barrett thundered again, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Most shooters, even seasoned ones, wore their struggle openly when handling the beast. The recoil was punishing, enough to rattle shoulders and bruise collarbones after only a handful of rounds. The rifle weighed heavy, demanded discipline, and punished arrogance. But she made it look effortless. Her body barely shifted. No grunt, no wince. She absorbed the recoil with grace, the way a river stone endures the current. The chief knew the Barrett well. He'd fired it more times than he could count. He respected it like a wild animal, useful, but dangerous if mishandled. Watching her cradle it like a trusted partner unsettled him. Crack. Another shot rang out. Through his binoculars, a spotter called the impact. Steel, dead center. There were murmurs along the firing line now. A few shooters had stopped their own drills, subtly turning to watch. She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. She cycled the action, slow and precise, then leaned back into the scope. The chief's eyes narrowed. Timing was everything in long-range shooting. Most soldiers fired too quickly, eager to see results. Others hesitated too long, letting nerves poison their aim. But she operated in a rhythm that was unnatural, calm, deliberate, as though she was waiting not just for her shot, but for the world itself to align with her trigger finger. The Barrett roared again, the sound echoing like artillery across the valley. Another hit. The chief caught himself smiling. Not a wide grin, but the faint smirk of a predator recognizing another. He'd spent decades training the best, leading men into places where hesitation meant death. He knew skill. He knew luck. And this woman, whoever she was, wasn't relying on luck. Her posture fascinated him. Most shooters had a tell. A tightening jaw, a shift in breathing, the tiniest twitch before the trigger pull. She gave nothing away. To the untrained eye, she looked like a statue lying in the sand. But the chief saw what was really happening. Her whole body was synchronized to a single purpose. Every muscle, every breath, every beat of her heart had been tamed to serve the shot. Another impact rang out. Dead center again. A younger soldier 2 benches down lowered his own rifle and muttered, "No way." The chief glanced at him but said nothing. Instead, he stepped closer, boots crunching on the gravel. He wanted a better angle, not just of her shots, but of her face, her expression. Some shooters lit up with satisfaction after every hit, hungry for approval. Others showed raw determination, chasing the next success. But her expression was unreadable. Cold, quiet, focused. She wasn't shooting for recognition. She wasn't shooting to prove anything. She was simply executing. Another shot rang out, the Barrett's muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of dust. The chief didn't need to hear the spotter call this one. He already knew it had landed. He could almost feel it. And then it happened. On the next shot, after the echo rolled away, silence fell heavier than before. No one spoke. Even the spotter paused, his usual clipped steel call caught in his throat. She had hit not just the target, but the smallest painted circle on its edge, a bullseye that most men on the line wouldn't even attempt. The silence stretched. Dust settled. Finally, someone whispered, "Jesus Christ." The chief's jaw tightened. He had been in firefights where silence meant danger, where the pause before the storm carried more weight than the chaos that followed. And somehow, this silence felt the same. As if everyone there understood they had just witnessed something rare. Something almost unnatural. The woman didn't break her focus. She cycled the action again, chambering another round. No celebration. No acknowledgement of the murmurs around her. Just the same steady breathing, the same patient rhythm. The chief couldn't look away. He thought about the thousands of shooters he'd trained, the hundreds of missions he'd led, the countless times he'd seen men break under pressure. And here was someone who carried herself with the calm of a glacier, unmoved by heat, noise, or even the weight of eyes watching her. "Chief," one of his men muttered, stepping up beside him. "You seeing this?" "I'm seeing it," the chief replied, his voice low. "Who is she?" The chief didn't answer. He didn't know. But every instinct in his body screamed that she wasn't here for simple training. Soldiers like her weren't made by chance. They were carved, piece by piece, through fire and silence, through battles most people would never hear about. Another shot. Another bullseye. The murmurs grew louder. One soldier let out a low whistle. Another shook his head in disbelief. The range had shifted from routine drills to something else entirely, an audience watching a performance, unsure whether they were seeing human skill or something beyond it. The chief noticed the smallest detail then, her trigger squeeze. Smooth, clean, with no anticipation, no jerk. It was the kind of trigger control that only came from years of conditioning, from 1,000 shots where the difference between life and death depended on one steady finger. She was a professional. Not just a soldier with good aim, but something rarer. Something refined. For the first time in a long while, the chief felt a twinge of curiosity. He prided himself on knowing his battlefield, on reading men and women like open books. But she was a closed chapter, a mystery written in a language only the rifle seemed to understand. The Barrett thundered once more, and the silence that followed was absolute. The chief knew then that this was more than just marksmanship. It was presence. And presence couldn't be taught. Presence was earned. As the range master finally called a ceasefire, the shooters stood down, unloading rifles and clearing chambers. She sat up slowly, sliding the massive Barrett aside as though it were nothing more than an old companion. She dusted the sand from her sleeves, calm and unbothered by the stares around her. The chief's gaze followed her every movement. She didn't flinch under the attention, didn't seem to notice it at all. She simply rose to her feet, slung the Barrett over her shoulder, and walked past the others with quiet confidence. For most shooters, the Barrett was a burden, something to be carried carefully, with respect for its weight. She carried it casually, as though it weighed nothing. The chief's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just talent. This was something deeper. Something forged. And as she disappeared into the shade of the barracks, he knew one thing for certain. He had to find out who she was. Because no one carried themselves like that without a story. And stories like hers didn't end quietly. The range fell quiet as the sun sank behind the horizon, bleeding the desert sky into shades of crimson and violet. The air cooled, though the sand still radiated heat from the day's relentless sun. Inside the barracks, the routine of evening settled in, gear being stowed, rifles cleaned, boots kicked off with groans of relief. The chief sat at the corner of the mess hall, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. It was bitter, burnt, and familiar, the taste of every base he had ever lived in. He wasn't focused on the coffee, though. His eyes drifted toward the far table, where a small cluster of soldiers huddled, their voices lowered but eager. He didn't need to strain to hear them. Gossip in barracks had a way of carrying, no matter how hushed. And tonight, every whisper orbited around one subject. Her. I'm telling you, it's her, one soldier said, leaning forward with wide eyes. That shot today? The way she handled that Barrett? You don't shoot like that unless you've done the impossible before. Another laughed, shaking his head. The impossible? Come on, Nan. You're talking about legends, not reality. No, listen, the first insisted. You remember that story from 2 years back? The record kill? 3,200 meters? Everyone said it was a Canadian, but I heard. He lowered his voice further, as if afraid the walls might be listening. I heard it was her. The table fell silent for a heartbeat. The chief's brow furrowed. He had heard that story too. Every operator had. It had been passed around camps, like a ghost tale, half disbelief, half reverence. A shot so long, so precise, it bordered on myth. 3,200 meters. Over 2 miles. The kind of shot where even the curvature of the earth started to matter. He remembered the details. A hostile commander taken out in the middle of an advance. A kill so far that the bullet had been in the air for nearly 10 seconds. A kill that had changed the course of a battle. Back then, like everyone else, he had dismissed it as exaggeration. Records always grew in the telling. But now, after what he'd seen on the range, he wasn't so sure. Another soldier chuckled nervously. You're insane? A woman? Making the longest confirmed kill in history? The first soldier shot him a glare. You saw her today. Don't tell me you didn't. She's not just good. She's... He shook his head, struggling for the right word. She's built different. The chief sipped his coffee slowly, masking his intrigue. He'd learned long ago that listening was more powerful than speaking. Let the young ones talk. They always revealed more than they intended. A third soldier, quieter than the others, finally spoke. I heard something too. Not just the shot. They say she's been deployed in places they don't put on paper. Places where if you miss, the whole team dies. They say she doesn't miss. The group leaned in, caught between fascination and fear. The barracks seemed to hum with the weight of the story. The chief leaned back in his chair, staring into the black surface of his coffee. His instincts wrestled inside him. He wanted to dismiss it as bravado, the kind of fireside legend soldiers spun to pass the time. But then he remembered her face on the range, calm, unreadable, detached from praise or fear. He remembered her breathing, her flawless trigger control, the silence she carried like armor. And he thought about the Barrett. That rifle didn't lie. You couldn't fake mastery of it. 3,200 meters. He muttered under his breath. He let the number roll off his tongue, tasting its weight. It was absurd, ridiculous, and yet his mind began breaking it down. He knew ballistics, the math behind the madness. At that distance, the bullet's drop would be measured in dozens of feet. The wind could carry it yards off course. Even heat rising from the ground could bend its path. To hit a moving target in combat conditions? The probability was near zero, but not impossible. The thought gnawed at him. Not impossible. The soldiers' conversation swelled again. One speculated about where she might have served. Another joked nervously that she could probably see through walls. Laughter masked their awe, but the chief heard at the edge in their voices that only came when men recognized something greater than themselves. Finally, the first soldier leaned back with a smirk. "Look, believe what you want. But I know what I saw today. And I know that wasn't just a good shooter. That was the shooter. The one they whisper about." The table fell quiet again, the kind of silence that said no one wanted to challenge the idea anymore. The chief set his mug down, his jaw tight. He had led missions with some of the best snipers alive, men who could thread a bullet through a coin at 1,000 yards. And yet, none of them carried the aura she did. None of them commanded silence simply by lying behind a scope. He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly weary. If the whispers were true, then she wasn't just another soldier. She was an anomaly. A weapon forged by circumstance and skill into something almost beyond comprehension. And if she truly had that record, he shook his head. Records didn't matter in the field. What mattered was survival. What mattered was the men beside you. Still, he couldn't shake the pull of the story. Because stories he knew often carried more truth than the official reports ever would. Across the hall, she entered quietly, her steps measured, her presence immediately shifting the room's energy. The soldiers who had been gossiping fell silent, eyes darting down to their trays. None of them dared say the word record now. She carried a tray, sat alone at the far end of the hall, and ate in silence. No glances, no conversation, just quiet efficiency. The chief watched her for a long moment. He wanted to ask her outright. Wanted to say, "Was it you? Did you make the shot the world doesn't believe?" But he didn't, because something in her demeanor told him the answer didn't belong to gossip, didn't belong to men chasing stories. It belonged only to her. He leaned back, sipping the last of his coffee, eyes never leaving her figure at the far table. Whispers were dangerous. Whispers built legends, and legends built expectations. And expectations in war could kill. Still, the whispers grew. And for the first time in years, the chief found himself wanting to chase one. The chief could only watch her in silence, but silence was her language. If the rumors were true, if she was really the ghost whispered about in barracks across continents, then the story of how she came to be mattered more than the shot itself. Stories like hers always had roots. She had been born far from the clang of barracks and the thunder of artillery, in a place where the horizon stretched wider than the sky itself. Endless plains, wind-swept fields, and a silence so complete it could make a child feel small. Her father had been a hunter, her mother the kind of woman who understood hardship without ever complaining. Survival wasn't theory there, it was daily practice. From an early age, she learned to move quietly. The prairie demanded it. Noise, carried for miles, and the slightest mistake spooked game before you ever saw it. She followed her father on long treks, her small boots sinking into the tall grass, her wide eyes studying the way he paused, listened, and adjusted his stance. He didn't teach her with words. He taught her by letting her watch. Her first rifle was a hand-me-down. .22, the stock worn smooth by use, the barrel nicked from years of hunting. She was 10 when she held it, the wood nearly too large for her small arms. But she carried it with pride, as though it were a sacred tool. Her father gave no speeches, no lessons, just a nod and a single box of ammunition. "Make it last," he told her. She did. Each shot was rationed, each round precious. She spent hours lying in the grass, studying rabbits and deer through iron sights, learning not to pull the trigger too quickly. Misses were expensive. Waste wasn't allowed. She learned to slow her breathing, to wait until the world stilled, until her heartbeat itself seemed to fade before the shot. By 12, she could drop a deer at a range that made grown men squint. By 14, she was better than her father. But it wasn't just skill, it was patience. She learned to sit still for hours, waiting for the moment when wind shifted, when the target lifted its head, when everything aligned. Other kids in her town fidgeted, restless with boredom. She found peace in silence. That patience carried into everything. School bored her, but she endured it. Chores were repetitive, but she executed them without complaint. In her eyes, waiting wasn't suffering. It was part of the hunt. Her mother worried, sometimes. Worried that the girl was too quiet, too still, too different. But her father only smiled with a kind of pride he never voiced aloud. "She's a listener," he said once. The world needs more of those. The world gave her harsher lessons as she grew. She saw what hunger looked like in lean seasons, when the deer migrated and the traps came up empty. She saw storms tear across the plains, flattening everything in their path, teaching her that nature never compromised. She learned to read clouds, to smell the air, to know when the wind carried more than just dust. When she turned 18, she had choices. College, a factory job in the city, or enlistment. The decision wasn't complicated. The military promised challenge, structure, and most of all escape. She wasn't running from home, but she was running toward something bigger. Her instructors noticed her immediately. While others fumbled through marksmanship courses, wasting ammo and rushing their shots, she treated every round like the old days, precious, deliberate, final. Drill sergeants barked at her to hurry, but when the results came back, her shots grouped tighter than anyone else's. At first, some of the men mocked her, called her lucky, called her soft. But luck didn't last. Luck didn't put bullet after bullet through the same hole. One by one, they stopped laughing. Selection for advanced training came quietly. A name, on a list, a transfer order, a bus ride to a base where fewer recruits arrived and even fewer graduated. There, she learned the science behind what she had practiced instinctively: wind drift, ballistic coefficients, the Coriolis effect. Math gave language to what her body already knew. Instructors pushed her harder, forced her to take impossible shots under impossible conditions, while exhaustion clawed at her. And every time, she found a way to quiet the chaos, to wait for the moment when the noise of the world faded. She was no longer a girl lying in the grass with a .22. She was becoming something else. Her patience turned into reputation. Peers respected her, but distance remained. She wasn't loud, didn't boast, didn't drink herself stupid after long days. She stayed in the shadows, sharpening her craft. Combat changed everything. The first time she deployed, the silence of the plains came back to her. The difference was that this time, the stakes weren't rabbits or deer. They were men with rifles, explosives, and hatred in their eyes. Her first confirmed kill came at 600 meters. A clean shot that dropped an insurgent before he could fire on her team. She felt the recoil, saw the figure collapse through the scope, and then nothing. No celebration, no guilt, just silence. Some soldiers drank to numb themselves after their first. Others broke down, haunted by the face in their scope. She didn't, not because she lacked feeling, but because she had learned long ago that survival often wore an ugly mask. Her legend grew quietly. Mission after mission, she delivered. Each time, she returned without the cracks most snipers showed. It wasn't that she was heartless, it was that she had been forged for this. Her whole life had been training. The chief didn't know all of this yet, of course. He only knew whispers, fragments of gossip, but he sensed it. He sensed that her calm wasn't coincidence, that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was history written in patience and discipline. And somewhere, out in the dust of some forgotten battlefield, she had made the shot no one believed possible. 3,200 meters. The chief knew that kind of skill didn't appear overnight. It was built from a lifetime of silence, from wide open skies, from years of waiting for the world to line up with the sights of a rifle. And though he hadn't heard her story in full, he knew one thing for certain. Origins like hers didn't fade. They sharpened, they hardened, and they left a mark the world couldn't ignore. The battlefield didn't care about records. It didn't care about reputation, rank, or rumor. It only cared about survival. Her first deployment had been a blur of heat and dust, but the village that day was burned into her memory forever. The team had rolled in under a blazing sun, tasked with clearing a series of compounds believed to be sheltering insurgent fighters. The streets were narrow, the buildings crumbling, and every shadow felt like a threat. She had been positioned on overwatch, climbing to a broken rooftop for a vantage point. The Barrett .50 was heavy on her shoulder, the sling digging into her skin, but she welcomed the weight. It grounded her, reminded her of purpose. Through the scope, she watched her team advance. Boots kicked up dust, rifles sweeping arcs of suspicion. The village looked abandoned, but she had learned quickly that emptiness was a trap. And then it came. The crack of enemy fire shattered the silence. Muzzle flashes erupted from a distant ridge outside the village, a hostile unit firing down with brutal precision. Her team scattered, pinned behind broken walls as rounds chewed through stone. "Overwatch, talk to me." Her radio hissed. "I see them," she replied calmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pounding in her veins. She scanned the ridge through her scope. The insurgents were dug in, clever in their concealment. Most were spread across the slope, but one figure stood out, a commander, barking orders, rallying his fighters with sweeping gestures. If he stayed, the assault would continue. If he fell, chaos would ripple through their line. Her spotter, a corporal barely out of training, crouched beside her. His voice trembled. "Range?" She adjusted the scope, her eyes narrowing. The distance was staggering. The target seemed like a shadow on the horizon, barely visible. Her rangefinder spat out the number, 3,200 meters. The corporal swore under his breath. That's impossible." She didn't respond. She was already calculating. Wind, steady, left to right. Elevation. The ridge was higher, but her position gave her a clean line. Temperature. Hot, thin air. Humidity. Low, but enough to matter. Bullet drop. Immense, dozens of feet at that range. She steadied her breathing. "Ma'am, that's..." "Quiet." Her finger rested against the trigger, but she didn't squeeze. Not yet. She watched the target, waiting for him to step clear of cover, waiting for the rhythm of his movement. Her heart slowed, each beat measured, deliberate. In that moment, the battlefield noise fell away. The shouts, the gunfire, the chaos, it all dulled to silence. Just her, the scope, and the man on the ridge. She squeezed. The Barrett roared, the recoil slamming her shoulder. The round tore across the valley, a small piece of metal traveling faster than sound, faster than thought. For nearly 10 seconds, the bullet cut through the air. Then the commander dropped. The insurgent line faltered instantly. Confusion rippled through the fighters, their formation breaking as panic replaced order. Her team seized the opening, pushing forward with renewed force, clearing the ridge position within minutes. "Hit confirmed." Her voice crackled over the radio, as steady as before. The corporal stared at her, wide-eyed, disbelief written across his face. That was over 3 clicks. She didn't look at him. She reloaded, scanning the ridge again, ensuring no counterattack would form. For her, it wasn't a record. It wasn't glory. It was a necessity. 1 shot, 1 life ended, dozens saved. Nothing more. Nothing less. But word traveled. It always did. Back at base, the story spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered about the impossible shot, the distance, the precision. Some doubted it. Others swore it was divine intervention. But those who had been there knew. They had seen the enemy collapse, seen their survival hinge on a trigger pull no one else could have made. She didn't celebrate. She didn't argue. She didn't even acknowledge it. When asked, she shrugged, offering no details. To her, it wasn't a record. It was just another day in a war that demanded impossible things. But the chief, years later, when he pieced it together, understood the truth. The 3,200-meter kill wasn't about distance. It wasn't about skill, though skill had made it possible. It was about presence. About the kind of soldier who could quiet herself so completely, so absolutely, that the noise of war no longer mattered. Most people flinched under chaos. She thrived in it. The chief imagined her lying there, the desert sun scorching her back, the world unraveling around her, and yet still she had found silence. Still she had waited. Still she had delivered. That was her baptism. Not in training, not in theory, but in blood and fire. And from that day forward, she wasn't just another marksman. She was legend. The record became official in whispers, unofficial in reports, but eternal in memory. And though she would never speak of it, others carried the story for her, passing it like scripture from one campfire to another. The chief knew soldiers loved myths. But this wasn't a myth. This was real. And the truth was heavier than any legend. The SEAL chief had seen his share of myths come and go. In the world of special operations, stories grew faster than weeds, stretching the truth until it was barely recognizable. Men who had fired a lucky shot were whispered about as snipers. Those who happened to survive ambushes were called untouchable. Legends inflated around ordinary soldiers until the weight of truth collapsed under the pressure. That was why he didn't buy it. A 3,200-meter kill? From a woman barely in her 30s? It sounded more like a campfire story told to rookies than fact. Respect, in his eyes, wasn't owed to records or rumors. Respect was earned face to face, under the weight of chaos, where no excuses could hide weakness. He had watched her from a distance at first on the range, in planning sessions, moving with quiet discipline through the routines of a soldier. There was nothing flashy about her. No loud boasts, no swagger, no attempt to remind anyone of her reputation. In fact, she seemed to avoid the spotlight altogether. And that made him even more suspicious. Men who carried legends usually wore them like armor. She carried hers like a burden. The chance to test her came sooner than expected. The joint operation had been delicate from the start. SEALs working alongside a mixed coalition unit to intercept a weapons convoy moving through a contested valley. Intelligence had been patchy, the terrain unforgiving, and the enemy known for setting brutal ambushes. The chief's team would handle the direct assault. Her unit would provide overwatch and support from elevated ridges. The chief made no secret of his doubts. As they went over the plan, his voice carried its usual gravel, clipped and firm. "You've got eyes on us the whole time, right?" he asked. Her response was simple. "Yes. And if things go sideways?" "They won't," she said, her tone flat, not arrogant, just certain. He studied her across the map table, waiting for a crack, a flicker of ego, some hint of bravado. He found nothing. Only that same steady calm that unsettled him more than boasting ever could. The operation launched at dawn. The convoy was spotted weaving its way through the valley. Armored trucks flanked by technicals armed with heavy machine guns. The SEAL team moved swiftly, positioning themselves along the choke point. That was when everything unraveled. Hidden emplacements on the ridges roared to life, insurgent gunners opening up with devastating fields of fire. The convoy had been bait, and now the SEALs were caught in a storm. Bullets shredded the air, churning up dirt and stone. The chief barked orders, his men diving for cover. He had seen this before, the kind of ambush designed to drown elite units in firepower until they broke. But then her voice came through the combs, low and steady. "Chief, I've got them. Give me 30 seconds. He gritted his teeth. 30 seconds was a lifetime in an ambush. He wanted to shout back, to demand immediate suppression, but something in her tone gave him pause. The seconds ticked. Then her Barrett thundered across the valley. One shot, one gunner silenced. A second shot, another emplacement fell quiet. Her pace was methodical, unhurried, each shot chosen with surgical care. Where most snipers might have panicked, spraying rounds in hopes of suppressing, she dismantled the ambush piece by piece. 3 down, she reported calmly, as if reciting numbers in a ledger. The chief raised his head from cover, daring a glance through the chaos. Sure enough, the withering fire from the ridges had thinned, giving his men room to maneuver. "Move up," he roared to his team, seizing the moment. The SEALs surged forward, clearing the technicals with controlled bursts, grenades arcing into the convoy's core. Explosions rocked the valley, smoke rising in jagged columns. Yet through it all, her rifle cracked like punctuation marks, every shot precise, every impact meaningful. At one point, the chief spotted an insurgent creeping into position with a rocket launcher, aiming straight at his flank. He didn't even have time to warn his men before the rifle boomed again. The insurgent collapsed, the launcher tumbling harmlessly to the ground. The chief froze, realizing she had just saved half his team with that shot. By the time the smoke cleared, the ambush had been broken. The convoy lay destroyed, weapons scattered across the valley floor. The SEALs regrouped, battered but alive, while her unit descended from their ridge position to meet them. The chief approached her directly, brushing dust from his gear. He didn't waste words with pleasantries. "You had eyes on that whole time?" "Yes," she replied. "And you held until you had clean shots?" "Yes." He studied her for a long moment. She didn't flinch under his stare, didn't offer justification or demand acknowledgement. She simply answered truthfully, as if that was all that mattered. For the first time, he understood. Respect wasn't in her words. It wasn't in her record, her reputation, or even her impossible 3,200-meter kill. Respect was in what she had done, in the lives saved, in the discipline shown, in the silence she carried into the storm of combat. That night, as the men patched wounds and cleaned gear, the chief overheard his own SEALs talking. They weren't skeptical anymore. They weren't dismissive. They were telling the story of how she had picked the ambush apart with a calm that bordered on unreal. The chief didn't join the conversation. He didn't need to. He simply watched her across the firelight, cleaning her Barrett with the same quiet care she had carried into the fight. Respect had been earned, and it was absolute. The valley ambush had changed everything between them. The chief no longer doubted her skill. He no longer questioned whether the rumors had substance. He had seen her work, seen the way she dismantled chaos with calm precision. In the crucible of combat, she had proved herself in ways words never could. But respect was one thing. Understanding was another. It was later, back at the forward operating base, that the chief began to notice the quiet shadows that followed her. The others celebrated the victory, as soldiers often did. Laughter filled the tent, rough voices recalling close calls with exaggeration. trading stories over cheap coffee and stronger liquor. Men replayed moments of the battle like highlight reels, slapping backs, clinking cups. She wasn't among them. He found her outside instead, seated alone beneath the skeletal outline of a Kun's tower. The desert night wrapped around her, cool and endless, stars burning sharp against the black. Her Barrett rested beside her, dismantled into its components, each piece cleaned with the same deliberate care she gave on the range. The chief approached quietly, not wanting to intrude, but curiosity pushed him forward. "You don't celebrate?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Nothing to celebrate." He frowned. "We took out a convoy, broke their line, saved a hell of a lot of lives." Her hands moved steadily, a cloth running along the bolt carrier, removing the last flecks of carbon, "and ended others." The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence. The chief had heard snipers described as cold, detached, killers who saw targets instead of people. But her voice carried no emptiness, no boast, no regret even. Just weight. The kind of weight that never left. "You ever think about them?" he asked cautiously. "Every time," she replied. Finally, she lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, he saw something beyond calm precision. He saw fatigue not physical, but something deeper. A burden carved into the soul. "When you're that far away," she continued softly, "you see everything. Their stance, the way they shift their weight. Sometimes even the color of their eyes, if the light catches right. You wait, you measure, you time the breath, and then you end them. They don't even know you exist. You're a ghost to them. A shadow." The chief said nothing. He understood enough to know that words wouldn't fix what she carried. "People think distance makes it easier," she went on, "that it's just math and patience. But the truth is, distance makes it harder. You have time to see them, to imagine them, to know they had a story before they ended up in my scope." Her gaze drifted upward to the sea of stars overhead. At 3,200 meters, I watched him for almost a full minute before I fired. I knew he was a commander. I knew he was giving orders. I knew killing him would save lives. But I also knew he had a face, a voice, people who listened to him. She paused, her breath catching ever so slightly. That's the part no one talks about when they whisper the record. The chief sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. For once, he didn't feel like a veteran with answers. He felt like a student, listening to a truth that no manual, no training, no medal ever explained. "You carry all of them," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Every shot, every face. They don't leave. They're with me when I wake up. They're with me when I eat. They're with me when I try to sleep." Her voice dropped, almost breaking into a whisper. "That's the weight of distance. You can't hear them scream. You can't see them bleed up close. But you know, in a way that never lets go, that you reached across miles and erased them." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The desert wind whistled through the wires above, carrying with it the faint hum of generators from the base. The chief finally broke the silence. "And yet, you still do it." She looked at him again, her eyes steady despite the heaviness behind them. "Because if I don't, others die. My team, your team. Civilians who'll never even know my name. That's the trade. That's the choice." Respect was no longer enough for the chief. What he felt now was something else, something closer to reverence. Not for the legend, not for the record, but for the discipline it took to shoulder that kind of weight without breaking. Later, when the bass finally quieted, he lay awake in his cot, staring at the ceiling. He thought about her words, about the faces she carried, about the unseen cost of the calm precision that had saved his men. He had always believed combat left marks on everyone, but he realized Now there were marks deeper than scars, wounds invisible to the eye. And as he drifted toward sleep, one truth stayed with him. Her legend wasn't written in the distance of her shots. It was written in the weight she carried afterward. The desert sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the forward operating base. Dust clung to everything: vehicles, gear, faces, but to her, it was insignificant. She moved with quiet precision, assembling her rifle for another day of overwatch, as if every motion were part of a ritual older than the war itself. The SEAL chief watched her from across the compound. He had spent decades with soldiers who prided themselves on toughness, skill, or charisma, but none had commanded attention without speaking, without forcing respect. She did. She didn't demand it. She earned it every day, with every shot, every calculated breath, every silent vigil. He thought back to her first appearance on the range, the way she handled the Barrett .50 as though it were an extension of herself. He thought of the whispers of a 3,200-meter kill, a shot so improbable it had become legend before most people could even comprehend it. And he thought of the ambush in the valley, where she had saved his team with calm, methodical precision. But what struck him most wasn't her skill. It was her humanity. The weight she carried, the silent burden of every target, every life touched by her hands, however distant. The chief had always respected snipers, but respect was a formal thing, bound by rank and medals. What he felt for her was deeper. It was reverence. She moved past him without noticing, disassembling her rifle, cleaning it with deliberate care. She had never sought glory, never relished recognition. Yet her presence had become legend, not just for the record, but for the calm certainty she brought to every mission. Later, when they gathered for debriefing, younger soldiers could barely contain their curiosity. Whispers still circled around her, questions about the record, speculation about past deployments, murmurs about impossibly long-range shots that seemed almost supernatural. She answered none of it. She never did. She spoke only when necessary, and always with clarity and precision. The chief noticed how the younger soldiers watched her, a mixture of awe, fear, and aspiration in their eyes. They didn't just see a sniper, they saw a standard they could never hope to reach. After the debriefing, the chief approached her privately. "You ever think about retiring?" he asked. She looked at him, expression unreadable. "Sometimes," she said, "but the world doesn't wait for you to be ready. If I step back, someone else has to step in. Someone has to carry the weight, and the weight, it never leaves," he said softly. She nodded. "Never, but it teaches you something. Patience, focus, the discipline to do what must be done, no matter what it costs." The chief studied her for a long moment. He realized she had always understood that truth. From the plains of her childhood to the distant ridges of battlefields across the globe, she had learned that precision came not from skill alone, but from the willingness to shoulder consequences that others could not imagine. "Your team. They trust you," he said finally. "They follow you into hell without question. That doesn't happen with legends. That happens with someone who proves herself every day." She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. No pride, no arrogance, just acknowledgement. The chief walked away, reflecting on how rare soldiers like her truly were. Those who could carry not just weapons, but the burden of distance, consequence, and memory. Those who could step into chaos and emerge unshaken, not because they were invincible, but because they had learned to endure, to control, to act with precision when others faltered. Days turned to weeks, and missions passed with their usual rhythm of stress and danger. Yet the legend of her 3,200-meter kill remained a quiet echo in the barracks and briefing rooms. To the untrained eye, it was a number, a record. To those who had seen her in action, it was proof of something far greater, the intersection of talent, discipline, and humanity under fire. One evening, long after the sun had set, the chief found her again on the roof of the barracks, scanning the horizon with her rifle. She was calm, focused, lost in the rhythm of the world around her. The wind tugged at her hair, and the stars above seemed impossibly distant, like the very targets she had faced. "Ever get tired of this?" he asked, leaning against the wall. She didn't look at him. "Tired? No. Warm. Sometimes. But purpose. Purpose keeps me awake more than exhaustion ever could." The chief nodded. He understood. She carried a burden that few could imagine, yet she bore it without complaint. That was why she had become a legend. Not because of one impossible shot, not because of whispers or reports, but because she had lived the weight of every mission and carried it with discipline, clarity, and unyielding resolve. He thought of the soldiers she had saved, the lives erased by her bullets, and the countless more spared by her precision. He thought of the quiet moments afterward, the weight of distance pressing on her shoulders, shaping her into someone beyond myth. And he understood finally that a true legacy wasn't measured in records or medals. It was measured in trust, in lives changed, in the silent mastery of consequences too heavy for most to bear. The chief looked at her, and for the first time, he felt something close to awe, not just for the sniper, but for the person behind the rifle. "You've done more than most could ever imagine," he said quietly. She finally lowered the rifle and looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile brushing her lips. "We all do what we must," she said. "Some just leave a mark that people notice." The chief nodded. He had seen her mark. He had felt it in the sweep of her gaze, in the echo of her shots, in the lives she had touched and saved. And he knew history would remember it, whether whispered in mess halls or etched in records. Legends fade. Stories grow. But precision, discipline, and the courage to shoulder impossible weight that endured. She picked up her rifle, reassembled it with care, and shouldered it once more. The desert stretched endlessly before her, filled with shadows, threats, and uncertainty. But she walked into it with calm certainty, carrying the weight of every distance, every shot, and every life in the crosshairs. The SEAL chief watched her go, knowing he had witnessed something rare, something almost sacred. He didn't need stories or records to know her legacy. He had seen it in action, felt it in consequence, and understood it in the quiet moments others never noticed. And in that understanding, he found something he had never expected. The truest measure of respect, earned not in words, but in life, in distance, and in the weight carried between each heartbeat and each shot beat and each shot fired. She vanished into the horizon, a silent figure against the rising sun, a legend not for the impossible shot she had made, but for the discipline, courage, and humanity that had guided her hand through every crosshair. The desert held its silence once more, but this time it was a reverent one. And the chief knew she would not just be remembered. She would endure. The desert dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale gold across the rugged terrain. Dust and sand clung to every surface, the worn tents, the armored vehicles, even the soldiers' gear, but it did not touch her. She moved through it with the same quiet purpose she had always carried, assembling her Barrett .50 with meticulous care. Each motion was deliberate, practiced, a ritual she had repeated countless times. To her, it was both tool and companion and responsibility. The SEAL chief watched her from a distance. Years of training in combat had taught him to recognize skill, to measure discipline, and to weigh the true courage of a soldier. But she was different. She didn't demand attention or admiration. She didn't flaunt her legend. She simply existed, and the world around her bent slightly to recognize her presence. He thought back to her first demonstration on the range, to the effortless mastery with which she handled the massive rifle. He thought of the whispers about her 3,200-meter confirmed killer story that seemed almost supernatural in its scale. He remembered the ambush in the valley, when her calm precision had saved half his team. Each memory reinforced the truth he had long suspected. She was more than a soldier. She was a force, tempered by discipline and experience, yet grounded by humanity. Yet there was more to her legacy than skill. The chief had begun to notice the subtle weight she carried, the quiet burden of each decision, the silent toll of every life taken from a distance. Other soldiers celebrated victories with laughter and storytelling, but she found no joy in recounting kills or missions. She carried them alone, internalizing the gravity of her actions with a discipline few could fathom. Later, when younger soldiers approached her with questions about her record or past missions, she offered no answers. She never boasted, never explained, never relished the awe her presence inspired. To her, reputation was irrelevant. Only action mattered. And yet, her mere existence left an indelible mark on those around her. They learned by watching, absorbing lessons she would never teach verbally. Her discipline, patience, and precision became their silent instruction. That evening, as the sun sank behind the distant hills, the chief found her atop the roof of the barracks, scanning the horizon with a rifle. The desert stretched endlessly, the shadows deepening, but she remained calm, focused, her movements deliberate. The stars above began to burn sharp in the fading light, distant as the targets she had faced, yet familiar in their silent constancy. "You ever get tired of this?" he asked, breaking the silence. Her eyes never left the horizon. "Tired? No. Worn? Sometimes. But purpose keeps me awake more than exhaustion ever could." The chief nodded, understanding more than he could articulate. Purpose, discipline, and the weight of every life saved and lost all intertwined in the solitude of a sniper's existence. He thought of the soldiers she had protected, the impossible long-distance shots that had shifted the tide of battles, the lives erased to save countless others. He understood that her skill was not a gift, but a burden carried with unwavering responsibility. "You've saved more lives than most people could ever imagine," he said quietly, almost to himself. She finally looked at him, the faintest hint of a smile brushing her lips, almost imperceptible against the stoic mask she wore. "We all do what we must," she said. "Some leave marks that people notice. Others don't." The chief studied her, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of her legacy. It wasn't in the records, the whispered legends, or the impossible 3,200-meter kill. It was in the lives she had touched, the missions she had completed with flawless precision, and the humanity she preserved in the face of destruction. He thought back to that impossible shot, the one that had cemented her legend. She had aimed, calculated, and fired with a detachment that could have been mistaken for coldness, but he now understood it as control. Control not for its own sake, but for the preservation of life and mission. She had carried the consequences of that shot in the quiet aftermath, just as she carried the consequences of every other decision. Night fell completely, and the base became a quiet hum of distant generators and rustling tents. The chief remained on the roof with her for a long while, neither speaking, both observing the stars. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of understanding, respect, and the recognition of the sacrifices inherent to their profession. In that silence, the chief realized that her legend was more than myth. It was reality forged from discipline, experience, and the willingness to carry unbearable responsibility. She had not only mastered her rifle, but the art of enduring consequence, the moral weight of distance, and the solitude demanded by precision. "You understand the cost, don't you?" he finally said. She did not answer immediately. She only tightened her grip on the rifle and scanned the horizon once more, as though weighing the distance, the light, the wind, and the unseen lives that depended on her vigilance. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. I carry it because it must be carried. Every life taken, every shot fired from a distance, it shapes who you are. You cannot run from it. You cannot ignore it. You can only endure it and act with clarity. The chief nodded. He had seen the weight of war in many eyes, but few carried it with such calm mastery. She had endured what would have crushed others, and yet she remained present, disciplined, and utterly human. That combination, he realized, was her true legacy. It wasn't the record. It wasn't the legendary shot. It was her presence in the crosshairs of impossible situations, her ability to make the right decision under pressure, and her capacity to shoulder the consequences that came with it. When the operations ended and the soldiers returned home, stories of her skill spread in whispers and reports. But she never sought the spotlight. She walked among legends without claiming the title, performing feats others could barely comprehend, yet remaining quietly resolute. The chief often thought of her when he trained new recruits. He used her as an example, not for the numbers, the records, or the impossible feats, but for the discipline, calm, and human understanding she brought to the battlefield. He wanted them to see that true mastery was not about glory, but about responsibility and clarity under unimaginable pressure. Years later, the chief would remember that final night on the roof, the faint stars above, the quiet of the desert, and the unspoken understanding between them. He understood then that a legend was not merely someone who performed the impossible. It was someone who carried the impossible afterward, with grace, focus, and unyielding humanity. She continued to serve, silently shaping history one impossible shot at a time. Soldiers remembered her, not only for what she could do, but for how she carried the weight of every decision, every distance, every life she touched. She had become more than a marksman. She had become a standard, a measure of what discipline, patience, and conscience could achieve when fused together. The chief watched her walk into the morning light, the rifle resting across her shoulder like an extension of herself. Every step was measured, deliberate, and purposeful. And though she carried the weight of countless unseen lives, she did so with unwavering determination. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, full of threats and uncertainty, but she faced it all with calm precision and courage. Her legend would endure, not because of whispers or numbers, but because of the lives she saved, the discipline she commanded, and the humanity she preserved, even in the crosshairs of war. And the SEAL chief, having witnessed it all, knew that she would remain a legend long after he was gone, a silent, unshakable force that history could neither erase nor forget. The desert wind shifted, carrying the quiet of the dawn as she vanished into the horizon. And in that silence, her legacy lived on, as precise and eternal as the shots she had fired, and as heavy and profound as the distance she had endured.